Okay, so thank you for coming to my talk. What I'm going to consider is some recent experiments by two different groups where they look at the impact of liquid drops on solid surfaces that are wettable. And in particular, they show that for sufficiently low speeds, these drops can bounce off the surface without ever touching them because they're suspended by a gas nanofilm which cushions this impact. And what we'd like to look at is whether drops of this type bounce or wet, because it's known at sufficiently high speeds, these drops will touch down and wet. So experimentally, it was found that this is around 0.75 meters per second. And yet what we've shown is that if we apply the conventional model, which we see in all CFD type software, then there's no transition at all. The drop will always bounce. Now, if we supplement this with van der Waals forces, we can indeed see touchdown, but this occurs at very, very high speed, much higher than the experimentally observed touchdown. So what the kind of conclusion of this work is, which I'll show you, that we need to supplement the conventional model, not only with van der Waals forces, but also with gas kinetic effects within this nanofilm in order to get the transition at the right point. And what I'd like to convince you is that this is actually a relatively simple thing to do. So this has been published in PRL. There are extensive references and details in this paper. And here I'm just going to overview the main details. So these very nice experiments measured not only the shapes of the drops, but also the profiles of the gas films underneath, which you can see here. And they showed in particular that those films can reach heights of 100 nanometers or less. Now, if we consider the mean free path in air is around 70 nanometers, then something which can become even greater at reduced pressures, then we see that the Knudsen number, which is the mean free path divided by the height of the film, can become 1 or even more. And what that essentially means is Navier-Stokes fails in the gas, and we need solutions to the Boltzmann equations for accuracy. So the flow in the liquid drop is still described by the usual Navier-Stokes equations. And what they require is knowledge of the gas pressure and the stresses in the gas as a boundary condition. And what we're going to do is we're going to capture that gas dynamics using a lubrication model. So mass conservation gives us the following, and this essentially says that the drop is pushing down, and this creates some mass flow rate out of the film. And what we're going to do is try to work out what this capital phi is. So the flow is driven by two main components. First of all, the interface could be moving, in which case a Couette type flow will be driven, or there could be pressure gradients which create a Poiseuille type flow. And the flow in the film is characterized by these two types of flow, and we add their mass flow rates together to create the total mass flow rate. Now, if we were solving this for Stokes flow, there are some rather well-known expressions for the mass flow rates and the stresses for the Couette components and the Poiseuille components, which are pressure driven. And this here is formulated in cylindrical coordinates, which we need for this problem. Now, given that Knudsen number is 1, we need Boltzmann solutions, which on the kind of outset seems like a nightmare. But actually, what I'll show you is that these are relatively easy to incorporate just via the so-called flow coefficients. And these are coefficients which have been calculated from Boltzmann solutions. Here I'm going to consider only diffuse reflection from these two interfaces with the extra details in our supplemental. And these are known functions of Knudsen number, which have been calculated from the Boltzmann equation. So to modify our lubrication model, all we need are these extra two coefficients, and these are known functions of Knudsen number. So if we consider the mass flow rate due to the Poiseuille component, for example, what's useful is to think about an effective viscosity. So we can define an effective viscosity as the usual viscosity divided by this new flow coefficient. And this effective viscosity has the following form as a function of Knudsen number. And what you see is that when we reach 1, we've already dropped the effective viscosity by an order of magnitude, and it drops even further as we go to higher Knudsen number. So essentially the effect of this gas kinetic effects is that at higher Knudsen number, we reduce the effective viscosity, we reduce the viscous resistance in the film. So that can occur for either very thin films like we're seeing, or at reduced pressures where we have larger Knudsen numbers. We also have a shear stress component, and again, we can define an effective viscosity. And this has the following form and is a different curve. And these curves come from solutions to the Boltzmann equation. So after some relatively simple manipulation, we obtain boundary conditions for our Navier-Stokes flow. We have a second order PDE for the gas pressure with coefficients known and shear stress given by this equation here. And on top of this gas kinetic type formulation, we add van der Waals forces, which act from the solid onto the bulk of the liquid, and they manifest themselves through a disjoining pressure with the following form. And what we'll see is that this is absolutely critical to create the instability for touchdown. So the real power of our approach is that we don't have to mesh the entire liquid and gas domain. We can just focus on the liquid. So some really nice previous work by Ji Li in 2016, he looked at drop collisions in a gas and meshed up both the liquid and the gas, which is very hard because the gas film becomes extremely thin. What we do instead is mesh up the liquid with finer elements, and the gas manifests itself through the boundary conditions through this lubrication model we've developed. So now we'll look at results and think about when drops bounce. So the first thing we can do is look at these film profiles measured experimentally. Here's the experimental measurement, and here are our simulation results. And you see good agreement between the two. And we can see fine details. So for example, if we look at this particular time, we can see 1 minima here, and that corresponds to the blue curve here with 1 minima. And if we look later on in time, we see a second minima appearing here, and that corresponds to this kink at the spreading front. So this shows a simulation for a case that bounces. Here's the experiment, here's the simulation. The two agree nicely, and you see in this case, no touchdown and therefore rebound. But a key point here is that just because a computational model reproduces the shapes doesn't necessarily mean it's a good one. The real test is whether it predicts the transition accurately. What we see is that the experiment shows this transition at 0.75 meters per second. If we use the conventional model with just van der Waals forces, it's at 2 meters per second. And only when we add gas kinetic effects as well do we get close to this experimental value. So here you see touchdown occurs at 0.74 meters per second, but not at 0.73 in our model. So the nice thing about having this computational model is we can now do virtual experiments. So nobody has put this bouncing phenomenon in a vacuum chamber yet. And that's essentially what we're doing here. We're reducing the atmospheric pressure and looking at how the transition between bouncing and wetting changes. So here is the classical model miles away up here. And what we see in particular is that these red wetting cases are associated with film-driven instability. So waves are generated from van der Waals forces, which we can validate with linear stability analysis. And down here, we see a different type of connection where we see the edge being the touchdown point. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to look down here, which is changes in impact speed at reduced pressure, and see how this change in instability changes macroscopically the drop's behavior. So what we see in particular is that for the edge-driven instability, it takes a few milliseconds for the drop to contact, a few milliseconds from when it would have contacted ordinarily in vacuum. In contrast, for the film-driven instability, the contact is almost instantaneous. So the nice thing about this experiment is you can do it just with a side-on camera. The minute it touches down, it will wet, so you can just measure the time up to that point. So what I'd like to convince you is that this model which we've developed is very general, and it can be applied to a number of other free surface flows. So for example, splashing, where gas pressure effects have been mentioned. So that changes the mean free path. Things like drop-drop collisions, where there has already been some work. There are gas nanofilms formed between the drops, and problems like solids impacting on liquids. So the final thing is to thank my collaborators, Makita, Kirill, and Duncan, the two funders who paid for various people's contracts. And thank you for listening. If you have any questions, you can email me here or look at my website here.